Good morning, everybody. Wait for one more person to get in and get a seat. Welcome to another program of the Coronado Roundtable. I'm Christian Escoven, the president, and I'm happy to see you all here. No volume? How's that? Is that any better? Okay, let me start over by saying welcome to the Coronado Roundtable. And we do have a different program than was announced. Our speaker that was scheduled, Kevin Danino, was not able to come, so he canceled. So instead, we have another great program that I'm sure you will find very interesting, and that's from our own board member, Admiral Charles Martoglio. So stay tuned for that. But first, let us pledge our allegiance to the flag. Please join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty, and justice for all. As you know, our programs are recorded live on Zoom. So we'd like to thank the Coronado Public Library for that and its staff for continuing that service for us and the community. For those viewing at home, please mute your computer or device and please turn off your camera. You can use the chat box for the question and answer portion of that program, which will follow. The recording will be made available. The recording of this morning's program will be made available on the library's YouTube channel within a few days. For those of you in the room, please silence your mobile phone. If you can't hear, just let us know, and we'll try to adjust the volume or hold the mic up a little closer to our mouths. Our coffee, again, this morning is offered by Alex of the Malo Brew, the coffee cart in front of the library. We do ask for a $3 donation if that's amenable, and if you don't drink coffee, we appreciate the donation anyway. Our speaker this morning is Vice Admiral Charles Martoglio, who spent half of his 40-year military career in the U.S. Navy at sea and cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers, including command of the Ronald Reagan Air Force Aircraft Carrier Strike Group. He spent the other half of his career developing strategy and leading military operations, initially for the U.S. Navy and then for all U.S. military forces. He is a recognized expert in strategic planning and continues to be an active contributor to our nation's security, advising and speaking non-politically on issues impacting America, especially those in Europe and Asia. Additionally, he teaches master's level grand strategy and defense policy at UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. Admiral Martoglio is a 1978 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and holds a master's degree with highest distinction in national security and strategic studies at the U.S. Naval War College. Admiral Maroglio is married to Darlene, who is at the back table there. Hello, Darlene. She checks us in the morning, and she is herself a multi-award winning commercial banking executive who is also a Roundtable's treasurer and member of its board of directors. Both are active in the San Diego community and live here in Coronado. Would you please welcome Admiral Maroglio?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. I especially appreciate the opportunity to come and speak at this incredibly challenging time that we find ourselves in relative to America, America's position in the world, what's going on in the world. And so for the next, 45 minutes or so, or until my wife gives me the hook by saying enough, I want to talk about what's going on in the world, China, Russia, and America, and how they all tie together. And I'm going to do that, as the title implies, by talking about the continuum of engagement, how nations interact with each other. You can kind of think of it as the 4 C's: cooperation, competition, confrontation, and conflict. Conflict being a nice word for war. Yeah, right. And so today we're going to talk about America in the world in an era of accelerating confrontation and conflict. So let's go ahead and start. Many of you know, because you've heard me speak before, that rarely do I get through everything that I bring to discuss. So I always like to start with, if you remember nothing else about what I say today, what are the takeaways? We're going to talk about the great power competition, what it is, how it's impacting the entire globe, not just the principal players. Why is it important? It's because it's about how we're governed and how we set up our economic systems. And it's complex because it simultaneously embraces cooperation, competition, confrontation, and conflict. The great power competition's already at war in places like Ukraine and Russia. And without question, China is determined to win this great power competition. So how do we slow down the acceleration, stop the motion towards more conflict? Requires diplomacy. You got to talk to the adversaries. You got to be strong economically, because economic weakness is something that adversaries exploit. You got to have credible deterrence, with word credible being every bit as important as the deterrent forces that you have. And that credibility rests on America's capabilities, its citizens, American citizens' will, and the combined power of America and America's friends and allies. We can't do it alone. America is, without question, the glue that holds the free world together. If you remember nothing else about what I say today, remember these are the takeaways. Remember the banner at the bottom of the slide. In this great power competition, neither side has to win. We don't need to beat the adversary into submission. But neither side can afford to lose. Because what's at stake? How you're governed and where you owe your allegiance, and how your economic system is set up. We'll talk more about this as we go through the discussion. Those are the takeaways. And we're going to try to do that in 45 minutes. Yeah, that is a good chuckle. Gasp. Some of you have seen this slide before, but it's different than the last time you saw it. The takeaways are the same. There's a lot of stuff going on. It's all enormously complex. And every issue up there, well, it's pretty easy to come up with a bumper sticker that solves that one issue. Every issue up there is interrelated to 2, 3, 4, or 5 other issues that make it hard to fix individual issues. So what's changed on this slide? It's more dense than it has ever been before. And the issues that are up there are increasingly in the confrontation and conflict side as opposed to competition. A lot of stuff going on. Everything up there is a Washington level security issue, or it wouldn't be on the slide. And if you want, I'm happy to stay as long as it takes me to go through every issue on this slide. A lot of stuff going on. It's all hard. It's all interrelated. And a lot of it's getting more dangerous. Great power competition. Just to make sure that we all have the same sight picture on what the great power competition is. America and our friends and partners versus China and Russia and a slew of other malign characters. North Korea, Iran, Venezuela. And let's not forget that in addition to the nations, we've also got the transnational, the issues that aren't really tied to a state. They're tied to narco trafficking. They're tied to criminal gangs. They're tied to illegal movements. And so it's America and our allies on one side versus China and Russia on the other side. So when we talk about the great power competition, that's what we're talking about. Lots of people are involved. Lots of nations are involved. Beyond nations, you've got the criminal elements, the transnationals, the cyber issues. And as I said before, what's at risk is how you're governed. Is it some sort of democracy where everybody gets some level of choice into how they're governed? You get a voice. It's very true that there are different types of democracy and different levels of voice. But when you think of democracies, everybody gets some sort of voice in how they're governed, as opposed to authoritarian nations where it's top-down guidance. In democracies, it's much more bottom-up. And in democracies, our allegiance is to our region, our nation, our state, our nation. Our allegiance is to Washington, to our capital. In authoritarian governance, when you're talking about where is your allegiance, if we lose this war, if we lose the great power competition, where does our allegiance shift? Goes to Beijing. And that's why I say you don't have to win the great power competition, but you can't afford to lose it. Because if you lose, if the other side wins, your governance model shifts to the winner. And the economic system is regulated free markets, which is what we have. They're not really free markets, they're regulated free markets, versus state-sponsored capitalism, where the government chooses the winners and losers through inexpensive loans, through non-competitive bids, through regulated policy that keeps competition down, especially in the private sector, and it keeps foreign nations out. So it's state-sponsored capitalism versus regulated free markets, and authoritarianism versus democracy. That's what the great power competition is about. Does your allegiance and your money stay inside your country, or does it flow to somebody else? That's the reason the bumper sticker is a true statement. You don't have to win because there's plenty to go around for two completely separate systems. But you can't afford to lose, because if you lose, you subordinate yourself to the winner. Does that make sense? America today is pursuing three simultaneous grand strategies. Grand strategies are, how do you use all elements of national power to achieve your objectives? We're following three right now, unofficially, because we don't have a published national security strategy of the United States of America. The three that we're following, the one that we would like is a continuation of US primacy, where we are the biggest and only dog on the street, where we get to call the shots globally. American hegemony, it's our preferred option, but unlikely. The world has changed since the collapse of the Soviet Union and about a 10-year period where clearly our strategy was US primacy. Preference, but unlikely. More likely is this idea of a balance of power between China and Russia on one side and America and our allies on the other. Our powers balance each other, and we either agree or not to not go into the conflict regime. I'll talk about that in just a second. And the third grand strategy that's in play right now, and you hear about this a lot in the news, is this idea of spheres of influence, where the big dogs carve up the world and Russia gets Europe and China gets Asia and America gets the Western Hemisphere. That's why things like Greenland, Panama, Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina are all in play today. That's called a hedging strategy. If your primary strategies don't work out, primacy and balance of power, and you got to fall back to something, you fall back to your hedging strategy. So that's what's in play today, and all the elements of national power. And what are they? Economic power, diplomatic power, military power, and the power of information or technology. Those are the four elements of national power that nations use to try to influence other nations. All four of those elements are in play across all three of these grand strategy types, and all three grand strategy types are in play today. Pretty amazing. So what does that mean in terms of things that impact our lives? There's a lot of stuff on this slide. I'm just going to kind of hit the high points. What I'm trying to show here is the great power competition is represented by America and our allies, democracy and regulated free markets, versus China, Russia, and their associates, which are authoritarian and state-sponsored capitalists. Two different systems. The idea here is you look over here, and these are all attributes that you either want to share across the two systems or preserve for yourself because they have strategic or they're very important to your security and your way of life. What's good about sharing? It's kind of a rhetorical question because I'm just going to tell you. What's good about sharing? What's good about globalization, which has gotten a bad rap from both sides of the political spectrum. What's good about globalization is the reality is it's the most efficient way to run a business, where you look at return on investment as being the prime determinant of who you do business with. So if I'm going to invest $10 and you can produce something for me that I can then sell for $14, and you could produce something for me that I can sell for $16 with my $10 investment, guess where my money is going to go? To the $16 return on investment, regardless of where you're physically located. You could be in Madison, Wisconsin, or Shanghai, China. That's globalization. Money flows to where return on investment is the greatest without consideration of geography. The downside is, what if you're talking about things like critical technologies, strategic minerals, internet standards, all those things that could impact your national security? Do you really want to let return on investment determine who gets your very highest end chips? How about your very latest stealthy fighters? How about your greatest ships? How about your high-edge technology? Things that can be turned around and used against you in some sort of confrontation or conflict. So the responsibility of national decision makers, good national decision makers, is you acknowledge that we're pulling apart, but you also acknowledge that there are things that we have to do in common because it makes economic sense. So where do you put this intersection point? Where does the intersection point go on this range here? I mean, there's some things on the bottom here where if you don't cooperate, you can't achieve your objectives because everybody has to pitch in to do things like climate, food security, health cooperation. And there's some things that are equally obvious that you don't want to share. It's this middle ground here. Where do you put this intersection point to get an efficient doing things for the least cost and the greatest return on investment, and yet not giving away the family jewels? So the variables for the future, what we're really talking about is where does that intersection point go? What's the depth of separation? How far apart are we going to pull these two competing ways of organizing the world? Democracy, free markets, authoritarian, and state-sponsored capitalists. The second variable is how do we get to this future? We are pulling apart without question, and we should. The question is, how deep do you pull apart? How do you get there? There's only three ways to get to this future. You wake up in the morning and I look across and I see what David's doing and I adjust my policies based on what I see the adversary doing. It's called a tit for tat or salami slicing. It's very, very near-term focused. Or I can sit down with my adversary and we can talk. And in the next slide or two, I'll tell you what we'll talk about. This is the diplomacy side. This is why talking is good. And because you understand what's going on in the adversary's mind a little bit better. You understand red lines. You know what you can do. You know what you can't do. You agree on some things. So I can do tit for tat. I can do diplomacy and talking, or I can go to war. Those are the only three ways to get to the future. Pretty sobering, isn't it? The thing we have to watch, see this circle here that I call non-aligned nations. The nations that aren't hardcore attached to either America or China. Nations like Brazil, Indonesia, India, Saudi, UAE, big nations, influential nations, in some cases, very wealthy nations. The non-aligned, where do they go? We got to be careful not to force them over to this side, mostly for economic reasons. And I'll talk about that as we get to the end. So a lot of stuff on this slide, but I think it's a good visualization of what's going on in the world and what we're trying to do and what other nations are doing as well. Neither side must win, but neither can lose. What does that really mean? Why am I saying that? First of all, a vital interest, the definition of a vital interest is something you go to war over, something you're willing to go to war over. So you need to understand each other's vital interests so you don't just kind of blindly stumble into backing the opponent into a position where they need to go to war. There's enough in the world to go around, so we don't have to beat the other side into submission. We can have two completely separate ways of running the world, not particularly efficiently, and it's going to cost more money for both sides. But we could do that because there's enough in the world to go around for two separate systems. Prosperity is preserved if we push those two sine waves close together and move that point up without giving away the family jewels, because you're efficiently organizing the global economy. Resources are flowing to where return on investment is the greatest. And you say, well, you know, in this utopian kind of world, do you need a military? Yeah, you need a military because you got to be able to deter the adversary. Deterrence still counts. So that when David wakes up in the morning, he doesn't look across the ocean to America and say, boy, today's my day to go. They're on their knees. You need to be able to have the right forces at the right level of readiness, with the right capabilities at the right location, so that when David wakes up, he says, yeah, today's probably not my day. I'll wait another couple of days. Deterrence, right forces, right location, right level of readiness, right capabilities, and the national will to use that deterrent power if deterrence fails. The national will. What is national will? It's your will. It's your will. It's your will. Are you willing to stand up and say, I'm willing to fight for my governance right that I get to choose? Am I willing to fight for my type of economic system as opposed to state-sponsored capitalism? Am I willing to go to war over that? Because you can have the best forces in the right place with the right capabilities at the right level of readiness. But if David looks at me and says, but they got no guts, they ain't going to fight. Or even worse, David says, I've got all these information systems that I can use to weaken their national will. So I know they won't. If you break national will from capabilities, you don't have deterrence. You gotta have the package, the capabilities and the national will to use it if deterrence fails, because that's what keeps the wars from starting. And we have a whole bunch of senior people here in the audience today, and they will tell you the best war, the best conflict, the best competition is the one that you don't have to fight. We don't want to fight a war. And the best way to keep from fighting a war is to be ready and have the national will to fight if deterrence fails. That gives you the strongest deterrence. And some people will say, well, you know, you're a pansy. You're willing to sit down and you're willing to talk to the adversary. You're trading away stuff. Well, hello, welcome to the real world. You don't have to trade away your red lines. You know what your red lines are. What am I willing to go to war over? Everything else, it's okay to talk about. Because if you don't talk, you either do tit for tat or you go to war. Again, the higher that intersection point is, you're more economically efficient, and you're also deferring conflict. You're pushing it to the right. You're taking time to build trust. You know, on a personal level, if Harvey and I are having a disagreement and we really don't like each other, and we're kind of dancing around and kind of standing back, and yet for some reason I just start talking to Harvey, all of a sudden talking gets a lot easier. It gets a lot easier. It's not quite as polarizing. Discussion and diplomacy, very, very important. And it builds trust, thereby easing security concerns. And when you ease security concerns, what can you do with that intersection point? You can move it up a little bit. You can become more efficient. Neither side must win, but neither can lose. So you're preserving your vital interests. I'm saying to the adversary, my governance and my economic system, you ain't touching them. Xi's saying, Taiwan, don't go after it. President Xi in China. That's a red line for him. You're preserving your vital interests. I know what yours are, you know what mine are, and you're avoiding a Pyrrhic victory where, okay, China and America go to war, we edge it out, but both sides are smoking hulks. Who really won? Neither side must win, but neither side can afford to lose. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. These are all the things that keep President Xi awake at night. You know, sometimes people say, hey, Charlie, what keeps you awake when you wake up in the middle of the night? And I say, you know, my job as a strategist, not to keep myself awake. My job is to think of things to keep President Xi awake at night when he wakes up. He's got a raft of really complex issues, more complex than ours. I do want to talk, though, just again to talk about why China is acting. Why is Xi doing what he's doing now, which is so different than the previous Chinese leaders post-Mao? And the reason is, post-Mao, the Chinese economy was in such bad shape, that the Chinese Communist Party, the leaders of China, were able to say to their people, if you allow me to govern uncontested forever, I promise I will give you a better life every single year. And for the first 30 years or so, post-Mao, that was pretty easy to do because the Chinese economy was in such bad shape. There was all this low-hanging fruit out there that could be harvested where I, the government, could live up to my agreement with my citizens and give them a better life year after year. That changed about 2010, about 2 years before President Xi came into office. All the low-hanging fruit had been harvested. The world situation had changed, and no longer could the Chinese Communist Party live up to the handshake with the Chinese people that if you allow me to govern uncontested, I will give you a better life year after year after year. And so what you see is President Xi imposing all of these draconian internal restrictions on his people, because one of the things that the authoritarian governments fear more than anything is an uprising by their own people that they can't control, because they're not going to come out of that in one piece. And so you got all these repressive techniques being used internal to China, which is really a discussion for another day. But so why is Xi doing what he's doing internally? It's because he can no longer live up to the handshake with the people. And the people know this. They know they're having tough economic times. I'm going to go into that in just one slide. And Xi's dream is by 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China, 2049, China will be the global leader. Not a global leader, the global leader. That's Xi's dream. That's his China dream. Externally, that's what he's marching to. Internally, he's repressing the people. Some of his policy decisions, I often get asked, hey, Xi's he's got a couple months left in power and he's going to be overthrown. I hate to make definitive announcements, but in greatest probability, that's not going to happen. His policy decisions are under increased internal scrutiny, and there's some grumbling that is going on. But the likelihood of China failing or Xi unilaterally conceding on any significant issue to America is almost zero. August of 2025, last month, his direction to his Politburo: seize the strategic offensive in a fiercely competitive world. He ain't waiting for things to happen. He's going after market share. And I don't mean that in just economic terms. That's his direction 1 month ago. So anybody who thinks that Xi's on his back foot, that ain't a good way to read what's going on in China. China's economy in one slide. We start at the top. These were the good years. There we go. First 30 years after Mao. China internally was a debt-driven infrastructure development society. What does that mean? They're building things at a phenomenal rate using debt. And they're the globe's factory floor because of cheap labor. But what shifted in about 2010 or 2012 is the level of debt started to get unsustainable because all the low-hanging fruit had already been harvested that allowed them to generate that level of debt. So all of a sudden, their internal model isn't working quite as well. Externally, cheap labor. I do like talking to audiences like this because you have some of the same memories that I do. What does made in Japan mean to you as a youngster? It means cheap. It's junk. As I get out and drive my Lexus away. What a change. So what does that mean in terms of economics? It means that you go from a low labor wage rate where you pay your people next to nothing and they're happy because it's much better than they got before. That's one of the low-hanging apples that you harvested. To all of a sudden, they're saying, hey, it's costing me more to live. I need more money. So all of a sudden, this global factory floor, cheap labor, cheap things, it's not there anymore because that fruit has been harvested. Xi, very smart guy, knows this. Internally and externally, he's got economic sustainment problems. Internally, as you read in the media, they're trying to shift to consumerism. In America, our economy is about 2/3 American consumers, 1/3 international trade. In China, and that's very normal for a successful nation, a free market-driven nation. In China, it's the other way around. It's 1/3 consumerism, 2/3 export market. And so internally, he's trying to shift to consumerism so that he doesn't have to spend more on infrastructure development because they're already got some pretty good infrastructure. They don't need to develop more infrastructure. They need to get the people, the citizens, to buy more. But the people don't want to spend money because they don't trust the government to be there in crises if they need it and when they get old. So they save. They don't spend, and they don't have that much to save because their labor wage rate is no longer being met by things that are exported. Now, you do read, and next slide, I'm going to show you some of the Chinese successes. Xi wants to move up the value chain. So instead of making trinkets What's he making now? You all know the answers to this. You might not be able to articulate it quite. Yeah, artificial intelligence, solar panels, electric cars, batteries, all sorts of high value stuff moving up the export chain. Electric cars, batteries, semiconductors, I didn't mention those. But what he's doing is he knows he needs more money. And he knows he's got this enormous overcapacity, his ability to produce these things at scale that we can't even begin to match. And in order to attract, got to pick on somebody new, Toby, in order to attract Toby, who lives in another country, I've got to produce these really cheaply. China, have to produce these really cheaply. And so what he's gotten himself into now is the profit margin on what they export is so razor thin or non-existent that it's not adding to the economy. And what's Toby doing? Toby's saying, hey, wait a minute, China. I like the cheapness of your product, the inexpensiveness of your product, but you're displacing my workers. And now I can no longer afford to pay my workers and manufacture inside my country. So the economic model that Xi is going after by saying, I'm going to export my way to wealth, all of a sudden is getting pushback, not only from America, but from a lot of Europe, from supposed Chinese friends is too strong, but certainly not opposed, nations like Brazil, Mexico, putting up trade barriers to China because they're worried about their workforce and the Chinese model of I'll give you 50,000 units where I make 1 penny each. And all of a sudden, that's half the cost of what it costs you to produce something. Of course, your people are going to love it until they don't have any money because they don't have a job. And so that's where the world is today in terms of Chinese economics. Chinese debt, their labor costs, consumer distrust. I say both ways. Because the government doesn't trust the people to spend money in a manner that supports the government. And the people don't trust the government to cover their backsides if things go badly, which is why consumerism is failing. Stimulus aversion, Xi is not able or not wanting yet to go into greater debt. And global tariffs, they all threaten China's economic shift. There are some success stories, I hate to say. It's all on the high end. Little of it is good for America. Without question, 4 to 5 times the manufacturing capability of all of the rest of the world in solar and batteries. 4 to 5 times in robotics over America. There are 5 times more robots working in China than there are in America. Space exploration. You hear a lot about semiconductors and chips. They're in second place, but they're closing and they're surprising us all the time. You can see the rest of the list. China's exports have grown during 2025, even with America's trade tariffs. China is exporting more in 25 than they did in 24 because global demand saying, I want that inexpensive electric car is greater than America saying, don't send your stuff here. So China has not seen an export drop. But what they have seen, because of their economic policy, is for every unit they export, they make a little bit less money. And that's an unsustainable business model where I cut to absolute zero profit or even worse, where you have government subsidies, you can't sustain that long term. And many nations understand China's export strategy, and they understand that it's not in their nation's interest to buy inexpensive stuff from China when it puts their workers out of business. Very quickly, I want to talk about Russia and the war in Ukraine. And I'm going to do it from an Eastern European perspective. In addition to what's going on in Ukraine, what Putin is trying to do are these three bullets here. He wants to build his sphere of influence like the Soviet Union had during the Cold War. He wants to fracture the European Union. He wants to roll back and divide NATO. And he wants to isolate America from Europe, break that transatlantic bridge, because that's in Russia's national interests. Ukraine is a part of that process, but not in totality. The truth is, a hybrid war has already begun in Europe beyond Ukraine. These are all the things that Russia is doing in Europe and even in America, and some of them. I'm going to highlight the ones that I have circled. Deep and large-scale aviation probes into Europe from Russia, flying fighters and drones, not into Ukraine, which is happening every day in huge numbers, but into Poland, into Estonia, into Romania, into NATO. Doing it for a whole variety of reasons. He's testing resolve. He's seeing what happens. He's certainly testing the transatlantic bridge. Is America concerned enough, or am I going to get free rein in Europe? And he's numbing Europe to, oh, this is just kind of routine, so that if he ever does it for real, you kind of hold back defending until it's too late. Whole variety of reasons, none of which are good. Underwater activity. We were going to talk this morning about cyber, and I haven't hit very much on that at all. But, the cyber world that we lived in, it's all connected by fiber, a little bit by satellites, but all by fiber. And for years, the great powers have been mapping out those fiber networks. We know where every line goes, and we know where every line terminates. And so does Russia, and so does China. Control of, or at best, support to cyber criminals. Every network in the United States is under cyber attack every single day. In large measure because nations like Russia and China either don't do anything to stop it or aid and abet it by turning a blind eye, or actually fund and sponsor it. You probably saw in the media the number of servers and computers that were found in New York City just waiting to be activated at a time when it would sow discord and show America is in decline and not even able to defend their own biggest city. During the United Nations General Assembly meetings, when all of the nation's leaders are in New York, globe's leaders are in New York. Fortunately, it was discovered by the Secret Service a couple days before, and we were able to work around it. But as the people here who have made security their life's work will tell you, if you found one, How many more are there? They're everywhere. They're everywhere. Anybody flown into Eastern Europe recently? Poland, the Baltic nations, Romania, Slovenia. You don't use GPS. Well, you do, but you don't believe it. You back it up because the Soviets, so it's the Russians, are jamming the GPS signal and they're jamming air traffic control frequencies. And they're doing things like taking the boundary demarcations in the Baltic nations and moving them a little bit closer to Russia. And you say, why would they move it closer to Russia? Because they want some Estonian soldier to say, oh, there's the boundary marker, go over there. And now you've got an Estonian soldier in Russia. And Russia says, what are you doing here? Grabs him and says, you're on my side of the border. And then the boundary marker moves back to where it should be. I mean, these are the sorts of games that are going on in Europe all the time right now. These probes, these pushes, this hybrid warfare that Russia is conducting inside of Europe, above and beyond Ukraine. So anybody who says Ukraine is separate from the rest of NATO and Europe, that's very wishful thinking, folks. Very wishful thinking. And why does it make a difference? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on why does it make a difference? It makes a difference because Europe, not China, is by far America's largest trading partner. Remember I said 1/3 of our economy comes from international trade? That whole third certainly doesn't come from Europe, but a big chunk of it does. They're our biggest trading partner. And in addition to trade, which is, goods and services, goods are things you manufacture. That's what tariffs go up against. Services are not tariffed. America's a service economy too. And the US and the EU have $4 trillion each invested across the pond. So we have $4 trillion US dollars invested in Europe. Europe has $4 trillion invested in US companies. Bottom line on this chart is what I'm trying to get to. Europe's economy matters to America, to American workers, and it's the key to anything involving China. Alliance realities. We talked about the elements of national power: economic power, diplomatic power, military power, and the power of technology. I've tried to capture that on this slide here. The only thing I'm going to talk about on this slide is the line by the blue arrow. America and our allies have a combined gross domestic product of $56 trillion per year. That's the summation of all the goods, things you manufacture, and services like financial services, travel, that sort of thing. Goods and services, collectively, we generate $56 trillion per year. About half of that is from the United States. Our gross domestic product, US gross domestic product, is about 27 of the 56. China's gross domestic product is about 18 or 19 trillion dollars per year. America, 27, America and our allies, 56. Russia's gross domestic product is a little over $2 trillion per year. $2 trillion per year, less than the state of California. China and Russia together about 20, 21 trillion, America 27, America and our allies 56. If you believe, as I do, that it's all about the resources, it's all about the money, and I don't mean that in a capitalist sort of way, but you can't afford to defend yourself and stand up for yourself if you don't have the resources to do it. So if you're going into a great power competition that is increasingly getting confrontational and moving towards conflict, do you want to go in with America's 27 trillion, or do you want to go in with America and our friends at 56 trillion? I want to go in with as many friends as I can get around me. And their economic strength adds to that number. You don't want crippled allies. Every element of national power is enhanced with friends and allies, and the balance of power tips significantly towards America and our friends. So what do I pay attention to? What am I watching? Some of the things I've just talked about, obviously, and I'm not going to rehash those. I watch cyber. Where are the cyber attacks occurring? Where are they coming from? Are they probes and exploitive, collecting intelligence, or are they actually attacking or planting things for future attacks against things like financial networks, transportation networks, water supplies, electricity generation, all those sorts of things that we count on for our daily lives. Cyber is absolutely critical. Cyber defense, cyber attack, and cyber exploitation. You got to be able to defend yourself, or all the other things we have will go away in the first day or two of the war. They may come back. One of the pluses of cyber is if I've got a super whammadine tool against Harvey here, I can only use it one time because he's a smart guy. He's going to figure out a workaround and he's going to patch that vulnerability. So you got to save it for when you really need it. But when you really need it, you shoot that trigger, pull that trigger. I watch out for allies' economic trouble. Because when allies get into trouble or non-aligned nations get into trouble, I watch them drifting towards our competitors. Because they don't have any other choice. The only other choice is for their people to accept less in terms of their quality of life over the long term. So you got to pay attention to your allies' and friends' economies. Doesn't mean you can't do things to protect yourself. I'm not saying that at all. But you got to be measured. You can't schwack them off the knees. I watch for Iran's nuclear breakout. And I watch to see if we're going to follow through, and I'll answer questions on the Middle East during Q&A, if we're going to follow through on the back foot that Iran is really on right now. Or are we just going to stop and let them rebuild their capabilities? See what's going on with North Korea? Rising anti-Americanism around the globe, especially among our allies. Wild cards. Wild cards, runaway artificial intelligence or bioengineering that gets out of the lab. And then massive nuclear proliferation in places where it isn't today. Turkey, Indonesia, Saudi, Brazil, you can see the list there. Some other wild cards. Unfortunately, not so unreasonable. America's way ahead. Focus on America's economy. Grow our gross domestic product. Preserve the primacy of the dollar. Reduce deficits. Protect America's jewels and increase our resilience, meaning don't import necessary things from countries that can cut it off during times of crises. We've got to strengthen America's security. Here's a change in paradigm for many of you. We have to harden America itself. You know, America has an expeditionary military. We don't fight on the beaches of San Diego. We fight on other people's beaches. We fight the wars overseas so we don't have to fight them here. Guess what, folks? That's changing. That's changing with missile technology. That's changing with cyber attacks. And so we've got to harden America itself, our critical infrastructure, missile defense, border crossings, medical readiness, and yet don't forget about that deterrent capability I talked about. Even if you're talking and using diplomacy, you got to have that deterrent capability to make sure David doesn't say, "Oh, today's my day, I got to go." Toughen security alliances. So when you look at Europe and you say, you need to pay your share, nothing wrong with that. That's good. You got to step up and provide for your own security. The slide I didn't get to on Ukraine, the theme of that was, yeah, turn Ukraine over to the Europeans. It's their responsibility. But you got to make sure they can handle the responsibility before you shift your attention elsewhere or draw down your forces, because if they can't, you're either going to wind up providing that like we did in World War I and World War II, or you're going to have to shift to spheres of influence where the only place you trade and have influence is in the Western Hemisphere. And that means roughly 1/3 of our economy is a heck of a lot less efficient and robust because you don't get that much profit out of the Western Hemisphere. So it's in our national interest to make sure that, yeah, Europe steps up to the plate without question. But before we just say you're on your own, you got to make sure that they can handle it. And yeah, it's good to squeeze them and push them as hard as you think they can. But if you push them over the edge, it's going to come back and haunt us, including everybody in this room, because it won't take long. They need us. Remember, we're the glue, but we need them. America by itself ain't gonna prevail in this competition, folks. Investing heavily in next generation, harnessing all the elements of America's national power to reduce the likelihood of confrontation and conflict while preserving America's greatest attributes. My last slide. Over the last 70 years now, America's demise has been predicted many times on the left side of the slide. America is a sunset empire. America will never be as good as it once was. America is in decline. That's been said every single time for the last 70 years something significant has occurred in the world. And yet, here we are today with still the most powerful global military, with the largest economy by far, still influential diplomatically and economically. So why is that? How have we survived all these predictions that America's end is near? The term I use is America's robustness. It's these, I don't know, about 20 attributes out there that America leads the world in everything up there. And only America has this list of attributes. Other nations may be a close second and have 2 or 3, but only America has this level of significance and this number. And so this collection of attributes, this is what makes America great. This is what underpins America's greatness. And so my get off the stage line is the banner at the bottom. Look at these our collection of world-leading attributes and the ability to sustain every one of those for decades favors America in this great power competition. But folks, there's a caveat. If our leaders, our business interests, and our citizens honor them and use them wisely. And I'll stop and turn the microphone back over to the president, and he can decide whether you want to go into questions and answers or take a quick break.
Thank you very much.